Wonderful. So Joy, would you like to welcome everybody to our program?
I am thrilled that this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary, the celebration of women's suffrage. I'm just thrilled that we're here, that so many of you have come, and that we're doing this big, wonderful program produced by Lori and performed by the residents of FountainView and the women who are so supportive and have done such a wonderful view. Recall that each year we have a special presentation. We've seen some wonderful films on California Women Win the Vote, the wonderful Inez Milholland, and several others. Some of you saw Iron Jawed Angels, which is a commercial film, and it played here, and I recommended that you see it. And many of you told me that they wouldn't have come without my recommendation, but that they really enjoyed it. We'll show it again because some of you haven't had the opportunity to see it. My interest in celebrating Women's Equality Day and women's suffrage is that I went through elementary school, high school, and college. I never heard of Susan B. Anthony. Can you believe that? Certainly not Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Women's suffrage was not a subject. I was a political science major in college. I loved history. I learned about it when my oldest son was in 12th grade. I picked up his history book and I looked up the 19th Amendment, and it said on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and women were given the right to vote. And that's when I went into orbit, and I haven't come down yet. So they never were given anything. They fought for it. They fought for it. And then later on, I learned, actually, on the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, my dear friend and colleague, Pat Russell, had an event downtown to celebrate it. It was August. I took my kids in the car and we drove down to the event. And on en route, I said to them, I'm not sure I'll live long enough to celebrate the 70th and 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, but you will, and I want you to remember this. Okay, I've asked them. They don't remember it. But I do, and here I am on the 100th anniversary. That night, there was a special event with the suffragists that Pat could find in the Unitarian Church on 8th Street, just west of downtown. And I sat next to an older woman who clearly was a woman who had marched. And when I turned to her, used the word suffragette, she punched me. And she said we were suffragists, not suffragettes. That was what the press used to put us down. And so after that, that's been a cause of mine, that the women were suffragists. The British call themselves suffragettes, but since then it's a suffragist. Think of the power in the word suffragist. That's what's just so important. Okay, so with this, we put together this brief, short version of the history of the passage of the 19th Amendment, where women won the right to vote. And we begin with Fran Schuster and Emma Lazarus. Fran?
Okay. The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beaconed hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep ancient lands, you storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send me these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Thank you, Fran. That was so beautifully well read.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. So our next reader, we are actually going to go back to the roots of the suffrage movement, which started with our suffragists coming together for anti-slavery. So Reggie Shear is going to represent the very important woman, Sojourner Truth.
A former slave, Sojourner Truth became an advocate and civil and women's rights in the 19th century. Her civil work earned her an invitation to meet President Abraham Lincoln. Truth was born Isabella Momfrey, a slave in Dutch-speaking Ulster County, New York, in 1797. She was bought and sold 4 times and subject to harsh physical labor and violent punishments. In her team, she was united with another slave with whom she had 5 children. In 1827, a year before New York's law freeing slaves was to take effect, Truth ran away with her infant Sophia to a nearby abolitionist family, the Van Wagoners. The family bought her freedom for $20 and helped Truth successfully sue for the return of her 5-year-old son, Peter, who was illegally sold into slavery in Alabama. Truth then moved to New York City, where she worked for a local minister. By the early 1830s, she participated in religious revivals that were sweeping the state and became a charismatic speaker. She declared that the Spirit called on her to preach the truth, renaming herself Sojourner Truth. An itinerant preacher, Truth met abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Garrison's anti-slavery organization encouraged Truth to give speeches about the evils of slavery. She never learned to read or write. She dictated what should become her autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. Truth survived on sales of books, which brought her national recognition. She met women's rights activists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, as well as temperance advocates, both causes she quickly championed. Truth then began a lecture tour that included a women's rights conference in Akron, Ohio, where she delivered her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, in which she challenged prevailing notions of racial and gender inferiority and inequality by reminding listeners of her combined strength. Truth was nearly 6 feet tall and had a female, not a male. Truth ultimately spoke to Douglass, who believed suffrage for formerly enslaved men should come before women's suffrage. She thought both should occur simultaneously. Later on, Truth settled in Battle Creek, Michigan, where her 3 daughters lived. She continued speaking nationally and helped slaves escape to freedom. When the Civil War started, Truth urged young men to join the Union cause and organize supplies for the Black troops. After the war, she was honored with an invitation to the White House and became involved with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping freed slaves find jobs and build new lives. While in Washington, she lobbied on segregation, and then she wanted to get on a streetcar, and the conductor tried to violently block her from riding. She ensured his arrest and won her subsequent case. It's probably the first time. In the 1860s, she collected thousands of signatures on a petition to provide former slaves with land, though Congress never took action. Nearly blind and deaf towards the end of her life, Truth spent her final years in Michigan. Truth died at home November 26, 1883. Records show she was age 86, yet her memorial tombstone states she was 105. Engraved on her tombstone are the words, "Is God dead?" A question she once asked a despondent Frederick Douglass to remind him to have faith. Perhaps Truth's life of Christianity and fighting for equality is best summed up by her own words. "Children, who made your skin white? Was it not God? Who made mine black? Was it not the same God? Am I to blame, therefore, because my skin is black? Does not God love colored children as well as white children? And did not the same Savior die to save the one as well as the other?" And there was a discussion about the disenfranchisement of Black women. At that time, Alice Paul and the newly formed League of Women's should have taken up the issue, but some say Alice Paul stated that was a race issue and not a women's vote. And so they dropped the Black vote. There you are.
Thank you, Reggie. Thank you so much for bringing Sojourner's voice to our program. And we're actually going to hear her words, her "Ain't I a Woman," speech, and Carolyn Clark is going to read that speech for us.
This was delivered 1851 at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio by Sojourner Truth. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and I could bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't gonna say nothing more.
Great.
Thank you. That was so well read, Carolyn. Thank you very much for that. Now we are going to move on to our, what I would call the most well-known suffragists. We're going to start with Ruth Young, reading for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Hello, Ruth.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I've come from long ago and far away to visit you at this very special time. I'm in no way bragging, but I just want to inform you that I was considered an important and influential leader of the early women's right and suffrage movement, and what a struggle it was. Now, a little bit about me. I was born Elizabeth Cady on November 12, 1815 in Johnstown, New York. My father was a lawyer, a judge, and a New York State Supreme Court justice. My parents had 11 children, 6 of whom died, including a beloved older brother. I remember my mother is very depressed and my father wishing I was a boy. So I showed him that I had the intellectual capability and the desire to succeed in the male world. I had a fine early education, but there were no colleges for women. So I insisted on going to a women's seminary. Because of the hell and brimstone teaching, I felt Christianity and other religions degraded the role of women, and I became anti-religion. However, I was very drawn to the abolitionist, temperance, and women's rights movement. When I was 25 in 1840, I married the abolitionist and lawyer Henry Stanton. Can you believe that I requested that the word obey be omitted from the marriage oath and that Cady, my maiden name, be included with his, Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Henry and I had 7 children. 6 were planned, and we settled in Seneca Falls, New York. It was there that several other women and I founded the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The attendees drew up the Declaration of Sentiments, which I wrote. It was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. Our goal was to change the laws concerning divorce, child custody, dependence, and submission to a husband. Also, owning land, earning wages, college education, and voting rights, among other reforms. I'm so proud that many years later, my lecture to the New York legislature helped secure many of these reforms. I even fought to give women the right to ride a bicycle. I'm glad to see that today many achievements have been gained, but I also observe that today women will continue to struggle for other significant women's rights.
Thank you, Ruth.
No, I'm not finished. I got interrupted here, I'm sorry. I met Susan B. Anthony in 1851. She considered to be a major influence and mentor, and we were the dearest of friends and colleagues for over 50 years. We were both abolitionists and involved in the temperance movement, especially because of male drunkenness, but primarily the suffrage movement. As a busy mother and homemaker, I had little or no time to travel as a speaker. Susan was unmarried and a good speaker, so I used my talent to do research, craft women's rights literature, and also write most of Susan's speeches. Ours was a remarkable lifetime collaboration. With my children grown, I often traveled to give lectures and even called for a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. Although my husband was an abolitionist, unfortunately, he did not believe in women's suffrage. However, before he passed away, we both considered our 47-year marriage to have been successful. Susan and I wrote and published a history of the women's movement. I wrote the famous Women's Bible with my daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch. She later worked to pass the 19th Amendment. I also continued to write many articles and pamphlets about women's suffrage and rights, and was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association for 20 years. And there was so much more, but enough for now. We all know that it was, and still is, never easy to fight for what is right and just. I did my best, even though I did make some mistakes. Thank you for letting me share some of my history with you today. Though I passed away at the age of 87 on October 27, 1902, I'm so glad I could come back for a brief visit with all of you on this very, very important occasion. I thank all of you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for bringing Elizabeth to us and teaching us all about her contributions. Now, next, we are going to hear from the woman that worked so closely with Elizabeth. We're going to hear from Susan B. Anthony, and there is Sue Richter, who will let us know what Susan did for the women.
Hello, my name is Susan Bronell Anthony. I'm very proud that I was a suffragist. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
That I was a suffragist, and that along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we founded the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. I also championed abolition, the rights of labor and equal pay, and the temperance movement, which aimed to stop the production and sale of alcohol. Are you wondering how I was involved in all these phenomenal causes? Simple. I was born in 1820 to a wonderful Quaker family who were committed to social equality. Did you know that I was 17 and I was collecting anti-slavery petitions? As I stated, I was committed to the temperance movement. So I decided to go to a temperance convention to speak at the convention. Well, they didn't allow me to go to speak. I was a woman. That did it. I decided right then and there to take matters into my own hands, and along with my sisters, showed up to vote in the 1872 presidential election between Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley. Needless to say, we weren't allowed to vote. Later, a gentleman came to arrest me. He wouldn't even put cuffs on me because that goes on men. During the trial, the judge asked me if I had anything to say. I imagine he regretted that question for the rest of his life because I responded in what was called the most famous speech in the history of the agitation for women's suffrage. Repeatedly ignoring the judge's order to stop talking and sit down, I protested with, "This is a high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights," as stated in the 14th Amendment. I also protested the injustice of denying women the right to vote. The judge sentenced me to pay a fine of $100, which I defiantly said that I would never do. He then announced that Miss Anthony would not be jailed for failure to pay the fine, a move that had the effect of preventing me from taking my case to the Supreme Court. I admit I went against society's norms to show women that they were equal to men. Many, many times I told women that men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less. I never married. I was tireless in my efforts, giving speeches around the country to convince others to support women's right to vote. In my speeches, I said, there never will be complete equality until they themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. I declared to women that they must not depend upon the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself. I lived to 85, never gave up the fight. Unfortunately, I never got to see that the women finally won the right to vote. Oh, I must add that if I were alive today, I would not want a pardon because that would mean that I was guilty, which I was not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue and Susan B. Anthony. Thank you. Now it's only apropos that we learn about the woman that actually introduced them, and that is a woman that made a fashion contribution, Amelia Bloomer.
Let me introduce myself. I'm Amelia Bloomer, and I was born on May 27th, 1818 in Homer, New York. I married Dexter Bloomer, and we lived in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1852, we moved to Iowa, and there I worked for women's rights and belonged to the suffrage and temperance movements. My husband even gave up drinking as part of the temperance movement, amazingly so. Even though I did not create the women's clothing reform known as Bloomers, my name became associated with it because of my early and strong advocacy. I felt the costume of women should be suited to her wants and her necessities. While I'm wearing bloomers today, I wouldn't leave the apartment without them at all. Lori, do you have that picture of me showing my bloomers? You see, I really have them. Actually, I have a second pair, see? Okay. Yes. Okay. The costume was worn publicly by actresses who found bloomers sensible and becoming. However, bloomers were subjected to ceaseless ridicule in the press, even harassment in the streets. It was so embarrassing. I got stopped and abused everywhere I went wearing my bloomers. Well, I remained a suffrage pioneer and writer throughout my life, writing for a wild array of periodicals. I edited the first newspaper for women called The Lily. However, I encountered several obstacles early on because I was the first woman who owned, operated, and edited a news vehicle for women. And now, some history about what I am truly famous for. In 1851, I made a most important introduction. I introduced Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susie B. Anthony to each other. I led the suffrage campaigns in Nebraska and Iowa and served as president of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association from 1871 to 1873. I was very, very busy. In 1848, several women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and myself, held the famous Seneca Falls Convention. At this meeting, the attendees drew up its Declaration of Sentiments and took the lead in promoting that women be granted the right to vote. You know, it took over 100 years for me to get the recognition I deserved. In 1975, I was inducted into the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. In 1980, not 1880, 1980, my home in Seneca Falls, New York, known as the Amelia Bloomer House, was listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. In 1995, I was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. Yes, I was a pioneer, and that is my story.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I need to show this photo one more time. There we go, Amelia in her bloomers. Thank you so much, Amelia. And now we move on to another woman of firsts. This is our first woman to run for president, and that is going to be read by Ricky. Ricky, would you please read about Victoria Woodhull?
Okay. Born Victoria Chaffin in 1838 in Horner, Ohio, Victoria Woodhull was a radical in many ways during her lifetime and made history in 1872 as the first woman to run for the presidency of the United States. She and her sister became involved in the spiritualist movement of the 1800s. Woodhull became a popular medium, traveling around with her sister to entertain audiences. At the age of 15, she married Canning Woodhull, but the couple divorced in 1864. In 1868, Woodhull and her sister traveled to New York City, where they met Cornelius Vanderbilt. The wealthy Vanderbilt appreciated the psychological solace that Woodhull was able to provide him so much that he set the sisters up in business. The sisters started the first woman-run stockbrokerage firm. A free thinker, Woodhull created Woodhull and Chaflin's Weekly, a radical publication in 1870 with her sister Tennessee. The publication gave the sisters a place to express their ideas on social reform, including women's suffrage, birth control, and free love. The journal also published the first English translation of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. A strong supporter of women's rights, Woodhull often spoke publicly on behalf of women's suffrage and even addressed Congress on the issue. Seeking to be more politically active, establishing the Equal Rights Party, and shortly thereafter ran for the U.S. presidency on the political group's ticket in 1872. There is evidence that abolitionist Frederick Douglass ran as her running mate. Woodhull became a target for public scrutiny because of her many relationships and radical ideas. In 1877, Woodhull and her sister moved to England, perhaps to make a fresh start. She spent much of her time writing. She died in 1927 in England. She stands as an example of a woman who chose to speak out for what she believed in and is remembered as being the first woman candidate for president.
Thank you so much, Ricky. And as I'm listening to all these women, I am realizing that they have one thing in common, Joy. Joy, they have one thing in common. Can you guess what that is? It's a Yiddish word, chutzpah.
Chutzpah. Okay, very good, Lori. They do indeed.
We're going to move on to the Jewish women. Would you like to introduce the Jewish suffragists for us, Joy?
I will indeed. And before that, I will say that we heard that Susan B. Anthony voted for president in 1872. She didn't vote for Victoria Woodhull. She voted for Horace Greeley. Don't ask me. I wasn't there. I couldn't ask Susan why, but that's the story. And we move into the Jewish suffragists. And important as suffrage has been to me, I never looked at the Jewish suffragists until this year. Jewish Women's Archive on the East Coast has wonderful information on them, and much of the material that we're giving you today came from there. There are wonderful little briefs in the current Jewish Journal. Tomorrow it won't be current anymore, on some of the women we're talking about and some others. So it's really my pleasure to give you a few of the Jewish suffragists, and we're going to begin with Adele speaking about Ernestine Rose. And let's go. I'm on Adele. Adele's on the phone, not on Zoom. On the Zoom phone, with the phone. Okay, welcome, Adele.
Thanks.
Ernestine Louise Rose was a suffragist, abolitionist, and free thinker who has also been called the first Jewish feminist. Her career spanned from the 1830s to the 1870s, making her a contemporary to the more famous suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Largely forgotten in contemporary discussions of the American women's rights movement, she was one of its major intellectual forces in 19th century America. Although less well remembered than her fellow suffragists and abolitionists, in 1996 she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, and the Ernestine Rose Society was founded to revive the legacy of this important early 19th century reformer by recognizing her pioneering role in the first wave of feminism. Ernestine Louise Futowska was born January 1810 in Poland. Her father was a wealthy rabbi, and unusual for the time, she was educated and learned Hebrew. She was 16 when her mother died and left her an inheritance. Her father, without her consent, betrothed her to a Jewish friend of his. She confronted him with her lack of affection and begged for release. But he denied her plea. Rose traveled to the secular court to plead her case. The court ruled in her favor. She gladly took her freedom. When her father remarried to a 16-year-old girl, tension developed, which forced her to leave home at a young age of 17. She invented perfume paper for use as a room deodorizer, which she sold to fund her travels throughout Europe, finally landing in England. While in England, she met Robert Owen, a utopian socialist, who was so impressed by her that he invited her to speak in a large hall for radical speakers. The audience was so impressed that her appearances became regular. In England, she met William Ella Rose, an Englishman and a fervent disciple of Owen. They were married by a civil magistrate, and considered the marriage a civil contract rather than a religious one. The Roses emigrated to the United States, became natural citizens, and settled in a house in New York City, where Rose sold her perfumed toilet water. Rose joined the Society of Moral Philanthropists and traveled to different states to lecture about the abolition of slavery, religious tolerance, public education, and equality for women. Her lectures were met by controversy. When Rose responded to a slur in a letter by a competing paper and sparked off a town feud that created such publicity that by the time she arrived, everyone in town was so eager to hear her. She joined a group that included such influential women as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Pauline Kellogg Wright Davis, and Sojourner Truth, along with William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, to fight for women's rights and abolition. When Judge Hartel submitted a Married Women's Property Act to the New York State Legislature to investigate methods of improving the civil and property rights of married women and to allow them to hold real estate in their own name, she drew up a petition and began to solicit names in support. This was the first petition ever introduced in favor of rights for women, and in 1849, these rights were finally won. She was elected president of the National Women's Rights Convention and heavily supported by Susan B. Anthony. Although Rose never seemed to attach great importance to her Jewish background, in 1863, she had a published debate with Horace Seaver, the abolitionist editor of the Boston Investigator, whom she accused of being anti-Semitic, defending the Jewish people. She successfully lobbied for legislation in New York that allowed married women to retain their own property and have equal guardianship of children. In her later years, she attempted to stay away from platforms of controversy. However, within 6 months, she made the closing address at the nationwide Women's Rights Convention. Susan B. Anthony arranged a farewell party for the Roses when they emigrated to England, where they lived out their final years. She also began to advocate women's suffrage in England, even attending the conference of the women's suffrage movement in London and speaking in Edinburgh, Scotland, at a large public meeting in favor of women's suffrage. She died in Brighton, England in 1892.
Thank you so much, Adele. And on your screen now is just a really beautiful quote by Ernestine Rose. What is life without liberty, and what is liberty without equality of rights? So thank you so much, Adele, for starting us off. And Ernestine was very involved with the early suffragists that we had met before, Elizabeth and Susan Anthony. So now we are going to hear from a suffragist who is related to one of our most well-known feminists. Zita is going to be reading from Gloria Steinem a letter about her grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem. Thank you, Zita.
Pauline Perlmutter Steinman was born in August 1866 to Bertha, a homemaker, and Hyman, a cantor. But after the couple left Russia to live in Germany, according to family lore, that was passed down to me as her granddaughter. They left as part of the reform wave of Judaism, and also because Hyman Perlmutter wanted to write operas, a secular interest that the Orthodox had opposed. Thinking about this grandmother who died when I was 5 years old, I imagine that the liberal spirit of Reform Judaism helped her achieve a higher level of education than was usual for a Jewish woman. At a time when young women were told that intellectual activity was a danger to their reproductive systems, my grandmother graduated from Teachers Seminary in Memmingen, Bavaria, with a teacher's diploma. Perhaps that spirit also opened the way for her later work as a suffragist. After all, the Reform movement had broken the prohibition against women and men worshiping together. And in her discovery of Theosophy, a movement that gave an Eastern a spiritual base to Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism belief in justice and the moral life. Together with her dedication to her family and the Jewish community, these remained a lifetime interest, education, and universal adult suffrage and theosophy. By all historical evidence, Steinem was a remarkable activist. Over the years, she served as president of the Toledo section of the National Council of Jewish Women, national chair of the Sabbath School Committee, president of the Hebrew Associated Charities and Loan Association, president of the Federation of Women's Society, and on the Ohio Board of Charities. Women did not yet have the vote nationally when my grandmother ran for the Board of Education, and many resented the newly won right in Ohio. To frighten women out of the unnatural act of voting, gangs of men and boys surrounded the polls and indulged in what we would now call sexual harassment. My grandmother won by organizing women to go to the polls together. It was this sense of unity with other people and with all living things that I find inspiring in Pauline Perlmutter Steinem.
Thank you so much, Zita, for bringing us the spirit of Pauline, and we understand now why her granddaughter was such a force for the feminist movement. Thank you, Zita. Next, we are going to hear from another very important Jewish suffragist, and this woman, Rose Schneiderman, was important for the labor union, and Evelyn Bauer will be representing her. Thank you, Evelyn.
Rose Schneiderman was born in Poland in 1882. Her parents believed strongly in education for girls and sent Rose first to Heder and then to public school. In 1890, the family immigrated to New York City. When her father died 2 years later, her mother did everything she could to support her 4 children, but she was forced to place them in an orphanage temporarily. When Rose returned from the orphanage, her mother worked nights so she could attend school during the days. But when her mother lost her job, 13-year-old Rose left school after the 6th grade to find work. For 3 years, Rose worked as a salesgirl, but department store work, while considered more respectable than factory work, was badly paid. And Schneiderman eventually became a cap maker instead. Although she earned more than a salesgirl, wages were still low and working conditions poor. And Schneiderman became interested in the labor movement. Convinced that unions could help the working class, She organized her workplace into a branch of the United Cloth Hat and Cap Makers Union. At first skeptical that a woman could organize other workers, male union leaders were impressed by Schneiderman. Though only 4 feet 9 inches tall, she could command the attention of a crowd with her powerful speaking skills. She soon became the first woman elected to national office in an American labor movement. Schneiderman was also an influential figure in the activism following the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, which killed 146 garment workers, mostly young Jewish immigrant women. The scale of the tragedy provoked widespread grief and outrage. In a speech she gave at a meeting protesting the fire, Schneiderman expressed her anger that the lives of working people were not valued more, and she held citizens accountable for the poor conditions of workers' lives. Responses to the fire, such as Schneiderman's, led to the creation of more effective fire and safety regulations for the workplace. Schneiderman's skills brought her to a statewide and then national stage. In the years before women won the right to vote, she played a key role in the New York State suffrage campaign. In 1920, she ran for the U.S. Senate on the Labor Party ticket. Though she didn't win, her campaign brought attention to the needs of working people. Schneiderman became a nationally known figure and was both a personal friend and political influence on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, serving as the only woman on the National Labor Advisory Board and helping to shape New Deal legislation. In 1937, she took the post of Secretary of Labor for New York State. She campaigned for the extension of Social Security for domestic workers and for equal pay for female workers. She was a founding member of the ACLU. Rose Schneiderman always remained connected to her Jewish roots and was particularly active during the late 1930s and 40s in the efforts to rescue Jewish refugees from Europe and resettle them in the United States and in Palestine. She never married, but she did form close and loving relationships with several other women prominent in the labor movement. She died in 1972 at age 90. An obituary in the New York Times credited her with teaching Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt most of what they know about unions. It is interesting to note that FDR appointed Frances Perkins, a fellow activist of Rose Schneiderman, as his Secretary of Labor, the first woman to hold a cabinet position. We've come a long way since then.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Yeah.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you. And it's amazing. And this just really brings it home to Joy Pikus, what you said in the beginning of the program, that we never heard these names in our history books. And look at what these women did. It's unbelievable.
I find it totally amazing and totally inspirational. And I wish that I had known about them earlier in my life, but it's never too late to learn. I'll tell you now about Belle Weinstein, but I'm going to begin with a word about Jeanette Rankin. You may have heard of Jeanette Rankin. She was elected to Congress in 1916 from Montana. before women had the vote. But she served only one term because she voted against United States entry into World War I, and she was then not reelected at her next attempt to be reelected to Congress. During the term that she held, a young Jewish woman named Belle Weinstein worked for her. She was her legislative aide, and she was better than anybody else. She wrote her speeches. They were really a wonderful team. And I learned maybe 30 some years ago in a project that I was doing that Jeanette Rankin had this young Jewish aide. And I was about to do research on her when the project fell apart and I didn't follow through. And now I've learned about Belle Weinstein. And I'm so sorry that I missed these 30 years of enjoying knowing about her. I really channel Belle. First, she was the oldest daughter of Romanian immigrants who settled in Helena, Montana. I don't know why they chose to go to Montana. But I really identified with her when I learned that she was an alum of the University of Wisconsin, which is my alma mater. And she was just outstanding at the university. She was a journalism major. She edited the woman's page of the student newspaper. And she was elected president of the Women's Student Government Association. I served in that position too, but it was made a part of student government. And so I was the representative on what was called student board of the women's organization. So I really channel her and wish I had known her. And what was really fascinating to me, Belle Weinstein was born in 1891. She died in 1985. She was a contemporary of mine in her later years. And if I had known about her when our family visited the capital of Montana, Helena, and she lived there, I would have looked her up, and I didn't know to do that. Opportunity lost. Belle was very active in the University of Wisconsin in women's and student activities. The suffrage organization in the state of Wisconsin noticed her and asked her to speak to the legislature on women's suffrage. She did that and became very well known for how good she was. She was the first woman commencement speaker at her graduation in 1913. This was one outstanding woman. She went back to Montana and she continued to work on women's and children's issues. She met Norman Weinstein, and the name is spelled Winestine, so no difficulty in pronouncing that the way in which it was he and she wanted it to be pronounced. They had 3 children, and she remained mom and a household figure, but also active in so many causes in the state of Montana. She was known for her tenacity. She was known for being an absolutely wonderful speaker. She was known for her sense of humor, and she really dominated that level of Montana politics for many, many, many years. And I am so happy to have learned about Belle Weinstein, to be able to identify with some aspects of her life and the many causes she was identified with that she worked for. She worked for women's rights, for union rights for women, and for many, and for children. She just was on top of everything and an outstanding figure. So I'm pleased that despite my love for women's suffrage and my knowledge of it and my bringing it to people, I didn't know about Belle Weinstein until this year. So I'll remember the 100th anniversary, especially for this program, for all that's happened this year, and for my channeling Belle Weinstein.
Thank you so much, Joy. And I have up on your screen her advertisement, Belle Sligelman Weinstein for state senator. Quite amazing.
Love it. I didn't mention that she'd run for state senator, but she didn't win. But we both ran for elective office. That's pretty good. She's beautiful.
You are definitely kindred spirits with Belle. Now, Joy, we are going to now move on to the ratification. So would you just introduce the ratification, and then we'll have the Tennessee important only man on this program speak afterwards. But Joy, first introduce the ratification to us.
As was mentioned before, when the Congress passes an amendment, it takes, I think, a 2/3 vote of Congress and a vote of 3/4 of the states to ratify. There were 48 states at that time, so it required 36 states. 27 already had women's votes. And let me mention, which I neglected to mention, the state of California, women won the right to vote in 1911. It was part of the great reform of Governor Hiram Johnson that brought us the initiative, the referendum, the recall, and votes for women. So we were ahead of the game. And interestingly enough, most of the states, the earliest states that where women voted were Western states. Wyoming was, I think, the first, Utah, Montana, several others. So just totally amazing. And Tennessee was the 36th state to vote. If it approved suffrage, then the amendment would be ratified and women would be voting. And I'm going to let Michael Bernstein tell the story because it's a wonderful, wonderful story about a young man and his mom. So take it away, Michael.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harry T. Byrne, and I live in the wonderful state of Tennessee. I would like to tell you how a simple choice I made has led to a major impact on our great country. I was 24, the youngest member of the Tennessee State Assembly, when I and my colleagues had to say whether or not the Tennessee should ratify an amendment that Congress had proposed to add to our Constitution. Now, an amendment is only effective after 36 of the 48 states then in the US have ratified it. Congress proposed the 19th Amendment in 1919, and by the summer of 1920, 35 states had voted to ratify it. Now, the 39th Amendment was very simple. It simply said, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, it would give women the right to vote, an important but controversial right which many people disagreed with. In fact, the high levels of disagreement around the country led some states to delay holding legislative voting sessions. Oppositions here in the South, and by that I mean the South of the US and not the South of England, was fierce. Opponents using tactics like racism and the fear of Black women's empowerment to stoke resistance. Various business interests also opposed the amendment. Factory owners feared women voters would push for tougher labor laws. While the liquor industry was trying to overcome the women's temperance movement and end prohibition. These delays left our country very uncertain as to whether or not women would be able to vote. Many Tennessee voters did not agree with the amendment, but our state legislature said it would hold a voting session in August 1920. Now, it only took one more state to ratify the amendment to make it law. So this was going to be a very important session. And as a result, people, thousands of lobbyists, pro and anti-suffrage activists, and many others descended on Nashville. Those people worked very hard to convince us, the legislators, to vote the way they wanted. And they used many different ways, twisting arms, buying votes, playing dirty tricks. The liquor lobby, for example, reportedly defying prohibition, set up a suite in a hotel so that legislators could have some lubrication to vote against suffrage.
Can't talk. Hang up, call later.
Well, the pro and anti-suffrage women worked very hard on us, arguing with us and trying to see which way we would vote. They pinned yellow roses on the jackets of men who were in favor of ratifying the amendment, and red roses on those who were opposed. That's a technique that some people called the War of the Roses. Pressure from my party leaders and telegrams from my constituents led me to believe that my district was overwhelmingly opposed to women's suffrage. So I sided with the anti-suffragists, and I had a red rose on my jacket. Now, the ratification sailed through the Tennessee Senate, but it stalled in the House of Representatives. There was intense lobbying and debate in the House until a motion was made to withdraw the amendment. In other words, postponing it. The motion was defeated by 48 to 48 votes. In other words, a tie. Well, the Speaker of the House then called for a roll call vote to ratify the amendment and not wait any longer. The next morning, the pro-suffragists packed into the Capitol with yellow roses, yellow sashes, and lots of signs. But they seemed certain the roll call vote would maintain the deadlock. The Senate chamber was a sea of yellow and red roses when the roll call vote began. When my name was called, I quietly said, aye. I had flipped my position. The tie was broken and ratification passed. The chamber was in an uproar when people realized what had just happened. Now you may ask, why did I flip? On the morning of the final vote, I received a short notice from my mother, Feb Byrne. And what it said, and I quote, is, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with her rats. She's the one that put rat in ratification. No more from mother this time, with lots of love, Mama." And now I'd like to share with you my mother and I.
Wonderful.
What's this?
Statue of mother and son.
Thank you all very much. I think you can decide I'm seated and my mother is supporting me. Good for you all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Michael.
We need a shout out for the moms who said, "Be a good boy, Harry, and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." Famous words, famous words. Thank you for bringing them to us, Michael. Thanks very much. Or Harry, thank you very much for bringing
Harry.
Thank you.
a wonderful story, the best story of the ratification story.
Thank you so much. And now, Joy, do you want to say a few words about, just introduce our next speaker, Carrie Chapman-Catt?
Well, I'll let Sally speak for Carrie Chapman-Catt, the founder of the League of Women Voters, who thought that she would form the league and that would help women learn how to use the vote, and it was just a temporary thing. Well, it's going strong 100 years later. So Sally, do it. Let's hear it for.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sally.
it's 100 today.
Yeah.
At this moment.
Yeah.
Activist Carrie Chapman-Catt, who lived from 1859 to 1947. was instrumental to the cause that brought equal voting rights to US citizens. A teacher and then superintendent of schools in Iowa, Kat became involved in the Women's Suffrage Association from 1900 to 1904, and then again from 1915 to 1920, spearheading the movement with her ability to organize campaigns, mobilize volunteers, and deliver effective speeches. She was born Carrie Lane in Ripon, Wisconsin, spent most of her youth in Iowa, where she went to college. She became a teacher and then superintendent of schools in Mason City in 1883. This was an unusual achievement for a woman of that day, but no great surprise to those who knew her. Bright, resilient, and self-confident, she never acceded to conventions that made no sense to her. In 1885, Kat married newspaper editor Leo Chapman, but he died in California soon after leaving her far from home with no resources. Eventually, she landed on her feet, but only after some harrowing experiences in the male working world. In 1890, she married George Catt, a wealthy engineer. Their marriage allowed her to spend a good part of each year on the road, campaigning for women's suffrage, a cause she had become involved in Iowa in the late 1880s. Kat rose rapidly in suffrage ranks. Over time, she became a close colleague of Susan B. Anthony, who selected Kat to succeed her as head of NAWSA, which is the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Kat led the movement over the next 20 years, struggling against great odds and many frustrating setbacks. In Kat's approach to politics, organization was the watchword, and she was superb at it. From her first endeavors in Iowa in the 1880s to her last in Tennessee in 1920, Kat supervised dozens of campaigns, mobilized numerous volunteers, which was 1 million by the end, and made hundreds of speeches. She made skilled use of communication and publicity, fashioning disciplined campaigns and building a highly effective machine. She believed it was women's natural right to participate in politics on an equal basis with men. If women could vote, she argued, they would become a force for world peace and would help improve the conditions of life for themselves and their children. Above all. She was concerned with women's dignity as human beings. One of Kat's overriding goals was that of world peace, a cause she pursued throughout her life. Another was that the political process should be rational and issue-oriented, dominated by citizens, not politicians. To that end, she founded the League of Women Voters in 1920. It remains something of a monument to her ideals, devoting itself to issues and placing what it considers the public interest over partisan politics. Kat was proud of her role in this organization until the end of her life. The vote, this is a direct quote of Carrie Chapman Catt that she wrote in August 27th, 1920. The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours had cost millions of dollars and lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you never can comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense, and defeat a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling to you to make no pause, act.
Those words of Carrie Chapman Catt live today, particularly more than in most of the days of my life so far. Thank you so much, Sally, for being Carrie Chapman Catt. Thank all of you for joining us for this short history lesson on women's suffrage, celebrated every year and every day of every year. And coming up now in the coming election, be sure you vote early. If it were Chicago, it'd be vote early and often, but we'll settle for early. And thank you very much for being here. Thanks to the wonderful cast of people who's represented all these wonderful suffragists, and Michael for being Harry Byrne, and to Lori, our producer, and to Carolyn, our technical person, and to all of you who just made this, for me, an exciting and a wonderful and memorable day.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Joy,
And I
for
just want
bringing it.
to end on a quote. As women, we must stand up for ourselves. As women, we must stand up for each other. As women, we must stand up for justice for all. And that was from Michelle Obama. We're ending with Michelle Obama's words, everyone, and images of our children, our young women who are growing up in a world where women can vote and women can run for office. And what an amazing time. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. And Lori, thank you. The pictures you brought up were amazing. You're a pro at Zooming. So thank you, everyone. There's 45 of us on today. Thank you all.
Thank you. And we're going to leave. And here we're leaving on a note. We're looking at the Rose Parade from this year, the Suffrage Centennial Rose Parade, and we're going to end with the image of our Statue of Liberty. We began with Statue of Liberty, and we're going to end with the statue.
Beautiful.
Good night, everybody. And
good night, everyone.
We honored those women today. We really did. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Great. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.